Hi, I'm Hamish Black, and welcome to a bonus episode of Writing on Games. Don't worry, the next full episode is coming, but hey, E3 has happened, so we should probably talk about that, right? Man, E3 is in a weird spot, huh? It was once considered to be the behemoth of the video game industry, but I feel like every year that title is slipping away more and more as people continually question its place in the industry. That's not to say that it's less interesting to watch as companies pull out and strategies constantly change. Quite the opposite. It's actually pretty fascinating to see how the show tries, and sometimes fails, to keep up with industry expectations to do with marketing and such. I actually made a video at the start of the channel regarding Microsoft's Gamescom conference last year, which understandably not a lot of people watched given the size of the channel at the time. I feel like a lot of what I'm going to talk about here will be drawing from what I stated in that other video because, hey, it's not just one conference that this stuff applies to. As marketing strategies continue to evolve and companies find more ways to communicate to fans directly, the relevancy of these shows kinda has to be questioned in some way. And E3 itself is trying to find new ways to stay in the public eye. And it's not like this is very subtle either. What used to be solely a trade show has become much more public focused. Forgetting the fact that this year they have introduced a separate public show, with the probable eventuality being that the main show is open to the public at some point, just the structure of the press conferences seems far more like it's trying to play to an audience. If you examine press conferences of yore, they absolutely would not play today. It's a mess of PowerPoints and statistics and graphs and spreadsheets. Like I say, it's a trade show, so they were trying to communicate the digits that truly mattered to shareholders directly to the shareholders. It's genuinely interesting to watch from an archival or research perspective, but when compared to modern day conferences, they're a different beast entirely. Now, with the proliferation of live streaming, the dominance of internet discussions, and the visibility of these discussions to game devs and publishers, most publishers have been forced to up the ante in terms of appealing not just to the people in the room, but the viewers at home. The pacing of these conferences becomes a key concern, at least to the public watching, and the personalities these publishers get on stage actually matter. We're at a stage in the industry where quote-unquote actual celebrities coming on stage feels tackier than ever because the development side of the industry has its own rock stars now. And those are the people the public want to see at these things. It's all about structuring a narrative around these press conferences and maintaining the right placement of peaks and troughs so the public remains engaged. These conferences are now less about communicating to shareholders and more about securing those sweet pre-orders. Now, like I say, that's by no means to say they're always successful in this. In fact, they rarely are. Remember here that we're dealing with an industry that to this day is still pretty shadowy in its wheelings and dealings, and yet has been forced into the spotlight in order to embrace the celebrity-like status that has been bestowed upon them. These people do not work in live TV. They do not have the personalities required of live TV presenters, and they come from a subculture that predominantly has been a means of comfort for those who don't find it in the spotlight. Hell, for a lot of them, English isn't even their first language. As such, the conferences are often an utter mess, with business dudes coming out and proving that they really don't get games, and then nervous developers coming out and proving that they don't get presentations. Cultures clash, mistakes happen, and memes are spouted at a near constant pace. There is always a certain charm to the imperfections though. The business dudes are often fun to hate villain characters, whilst the genuine passion of the developers shines through regardless of how nervous they are. All that said though, I feel like this year's show has been somewhat flat. For all the talk of this being the deciding year for how E3 continues as an entity, the press conferences mainly just seemed like business as usual. You had EA coming with everything you'd expect. FIFA, Madden, Mass Effect, Star Wars, a bunch of footage of devs working on pre-alpha models, Peter Moore looking like he was going to disembowel everyone in the fucking room, the usual. Bethesda came out with a Quake thing that may or may not be what people want, and then continued to focus on the elements of Doom that precisely no one gave a fuck about, the multiplayer and snap map modes, the Elder Scrolls Online stuff that precisely one person gave a hell of a fuck about.
Let's take a look.
And the Fallout 4 DLC that I may have cared about if the crafting system it was built on wasn't broken as hell. Microsoft's opening with a new SKU of the Xbone was strong, even if their games lineup didn't set the world on fire. Then you had Ubisoft, whose usually exciting conference fell somewhere in the middle of poorly scheduled, ill thought out, and at times often tone deaf, with a seemingly heartfelt statement regarding the Orlando Gay Club shooting, being followed almost immediately with a couple of actor dweebs pretending to have banter in Ghost Recon as they shot non-Americans in the face with assault rifles. I'm sorry, but that part really just stuck in my craw. I mean, besides them not knowing when the fuck to end a press conference, Jesus Christ. Then there was Sony, who I actually feel were the only real highlight of this year's show, but we'll get onto that in a bit. Oh, also, Nintendo's Treehouse stream. Zelda looked great. Pokemon looked Pokemon. It looked Pokemon for all of the 45 minutes they spent talking about it. All around, outside of Sony, there just wasn't anything to really get excited about. That said, there were a lot of interesting implications surrounding each of these conferences and the reveals within, some of which I'll talk about now. For one, perhaps the reason this show as a whole wasn't that exciting was because, perhaps more so than in the past, or maybe I'm just more exposed to this stuff now since I started the channel, I don't know. We all had a pretty good idea of everything that was to come here. In the weeks running up to it, everything to do with the show was seemingly being released through unauthorized leaks, or simply publishers trying to get out ahead of the E3 buzz so they didn't get lost within it. This is part of the reason that I really perked up during the announcements of Quake at Bethesda, or God of War, or the new Kojima game at Sony's conference. It was partly genuine excitement for sure, but at least initially it was just a case of how did this not get out beforehand? Ultimately, this doesn't matter. We were going to find out about these games anyway, but the fact that I'm disappointed about this stuff at all falls in line with what I'm talking about when I refer to the theatrics of E3. At the end of the day, I'm still a fan of video games, and E3 is still like Christmas to me. It evokes that childlike wonder of not knowing what's coming, of building up that suspense and the final excitement when you find out what's actually happening. This may sound super dumb, but all the leaks before E3 felt like I was a kid and someone had just told me exactly what I was getting for Christmas. The reveals were still there, but the suspense of not knowing was not. That said, Sony were able to maintain some of that for me. They were the company I was most curious about. They have consistently won over public opinion in recent years, but this is mainly due to how reactionary they've been of late. When the Xbone was revealed, it gave Sony time to examine the public reaction to Microsoft's strategies and go entirely the other way. Last year, it involved them building the list of games that people wanted to see brought back, and pretty much listing them all off at their conference. This won over the hearts and minds of the audience for sure, but at the end of the day, it was difficult to tell when these announcements would actually amount to anything tangible. This year, whilst they certainly didn't touch on Shenmue or Final Fantasy VII, and with only a brief nod to The Last Guardian, which to be fair did include a date, which was all that game really needed, they were able to prove one thing, that even if they are banking on a lot of these old names that people remember fondly, that isn't to say that they're purely relying on nostalgia to get them through. God of War is a franchise that never interested me, for example, mainly because Kratos is perhaps the lamest character in all of gaming. But the idea that Sony could take a very well established hack and slash formula and turn it into a mix between Dark Souls and The Last of Us confirmed that they are not afraid of messing with formula, and that is something I kind of inherently respect. The fact that they came out with Kojima's new game in which naked Norman Reedus gives birth to a wee baby further cements the idea that they are not afraid of taking risks and surprising people. This was perhaps the year that Sony came one step closer to solidifying their position, not only as a company that can follow through on their wild promises, but as the definitive kings of E3. And with all that said, where does E3 go from here? Well, like I say, for all the talk of the relevancy of a big trade show like this year felt decidedly business as usual. Maybe it wasn't as bombastic as it had been in previous years, but clearly there remains a desire for the public to have this yearly celebration of the industry. and there also remains a desire for companies to capitalise on that. Sure, more advertising focused things like the PC gaming show might rear their heads. Sure, they might open up more and more of the show to the public. But honestly, I feel like the latter there is just the logical conclusion of the way companies have been heading for years now. Like I say, this show is no longer just for trade. In fact, in many ways, there is nothing that can be done here for press that can't be sent out in a press release. E3 as a show is aimed at analysing and appealing to public opinion. And as long as there is a public that gets excited for it, I can't see it going anywhere for a good while yet. So yeah, I hope you enjoyed my very, very condensed thoughts on the press conferences of E3 2016. This was just a little bonus episode, like I say, to bridge the gap between the last episode and the next one, which is taking a while, but I think you'll enjoy. A massive thank you to all my new subscribers, as well as to my patrons who make this show possible. If you're into the show at all, if you'd consider pledging, it would really mean the world to me. We recently hit a podcast goal as well, so I guess if you want to hear more of my E3 thoughts, there's a possibility that more of them could be coming this week in audio form. No promises, but here's hoping. Anyway, that concludes a bonus episode of Writing on Games. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.